last few days, el llamado cuentapropismo, to use the native term, both how it is practiced and how it is imagined, though I come at it from the worm's eye view of anthropology. I lived in Havana for about 2 years doing field work for my dissertation in and around some of the city's principal farmers markets. This week I sat down to compose a brief preface to situate this perspective for you, and it ended up becoming, I think, its own paper. So forgive me if it sounds more like I'm talking about my work than actually presenting it. When addressing an audience of people who are mostly not anthropologists, it's actually kind of fun because I don't feel like I'm talking to a choir. But I also feel like I need to apologize for what we do and defend it at the same time. There's a madness to our methods. Anthropology is the weird social science. We spend a lot of time dealing with real people in the real course of their lives and apparently doing nothing. We like to call it deep hanging out. I won't rehearse the pros and cons of ethnography here, except to say that the sort of sustained engagement it requires has the potential to enrich our knowledge in a way that surveys and statistical data do not, while of course making it hard to abstract from the messiness of lived experience any kind of replicable data, which drives economists crazy, of course. Another consequence of this approach is that everything, including social science itself, becomes data to the ethnographer, so we like to criticize ourselves and all the other social sciences in the process. There's a dual tendency here. One is that we get excessively navel-gazing in our theories, and I don't deny that. I'm not a fan of anthropology that works in that vein. On the other hand, I think it can have a healthy effect of asking us to question some of our long-held assumptions and asking how much of these are contributing to the way we see things and actually constructing the world in that image. And it's in that spirit that I'm addressing you today and trying to ask us to question some of our long-held assumptions about Cuba and the way that we think about Cuba. So I want to address two kinds of assumptions that we tend to make. I'll call one political and one economic. And I'll say something about each of them in turn. And I will get to some data too by the end, I hope. The normative political mode of thought on Cuba presumes that the only interesting stuff going on has to do with either the party, on the one hand, and the state, or with the people we call dissidents. Now this tendency, I think, comes out of our liberal democratic tradition that tends to regard the state as this monolithic agent ultimately controlled by relatively few people at the head of a complex bureaucracy. Those people can be elected or not, but in any case, they are there. They're in power. Then there are those who are not in power but aspire to alter the power structure. This is the opposition, or in Cuba we call them dissidents. And admittedly, there are interesting administrative and structural reforms going on in Cuba that have to do with what's happening at the party level in the state, and we're all following them with great attention, and we've heard a lot about them in this conference. At the same time, we also have this fascination with the dissident blogosphere and dissident culture that seems to renew itself every so often. And here again, there are interesting things going on. I'm not questioning that. It's interesting when people like Ioannis Sanchez, who's virtually unknown in Cuba, are invited all over the world and they're actually able to go there. But I submit to you that this remarkable fact, as well as the reforms we've been talking about, owe less to political action, overt political action, either in the state apparatus or among dissidents, than it does with the kind of subaltern political life that, more prosaically, began reforming Cuba well before Raul Castro took over as head of state. And this is where I'll get to some ethnography. The subaltern politics that I'm talking about, I think, emerges in everyday action of ordinary Cubans who would never consider themselves dissidents and actually shy away from politics in the colloquial sense of the term. Now, there's something more here, and this is a piece that I want to emphasize. To the degree that they do have politics in a social science sense, that is, they have a notion of what power is and how it works in the world, it is surprisingly socialist. Now, I don't mean socialist in the sense of the Soviet-style socialist state system. I mean it in an ideological sense, that most ordinary Cubans believe in the goodness of mutual solidarity and they try to practice it in their everyday lives. Now, this shouldn't be any surprise, because they've been under a socialist system with all kinds of ideological entailments for the past 50 years. We all know this. What we often don't like to accept is that there might be something to that that's enduring and worth giving credit to. And this brings me to the Invento that's in my title, and also to the normative economic mode of thought that I want to critique. Now, there's been in Cuba in the last 20 years an explosion of entrepreneurship, legal and illegal. Much of this work is marginal in principle, but in reality it touches everybody's life. So, cuentapropistas dominate in food distribution, from the campesinos to the urban farmers market, and you know, as many of you have been in Cuba know, you can't walk down the street without hearing a carretero offering mango a 5 pesos y tal, cosas así. There are barbers who make house calls, pirate taxi drivers in their American jalopies driving down the street, giving rides to people for 10 pesos, etc., etc. And as we've already been discussing here, the current administration has issued hundreds of thousands of new self-employment licenses and updated cuentapropista regulations, bringing the non-state sectors something like 1 million people. But it's got to be more than that. I mean, it really, if you've been to Cuba recently, you'll know that, you know, as was pointed out yesterday, even rank-and-file state workers use their positions in unofficial capacities. So they, in a sense, are also cuentapropistas, okay? They're self-employed. Now, starting in the special period, Cubans coined new terms to characterize the social networks and practices that sustain this work, because it's not done, although we call these people self-employed, it's not done by yourself, right? It's done in a social context. And these words, you all know them: resolver, luchar, inventar. I like inventar and invento because I think of these as the kind of master trope of invention that characterizes this kind of sociality. And together these terms capture nicely the essence of how Cubans, the ones I knew anyway, like to think about their private sector markets, a kind of invention that they have created in a peculiar context that, for lack of a better word, we'll call late socialism. Now, by and large, they do not view their invento practices as capitalism naturally breaking through the cracks in the socialist command economy, which is how I think it often gets interpreted in the US press and among US academics. Many entrepreneurs understand what they do as proper socialism, even when it is carried out in contradiction with state regulations, which is often. The argument here is that they engage in market exchange in the ethos of reciprocity and according to a moral code that dictates that they should compete with but not defeat one another. But the normative economic mode of thought with which I have a problem presumes that they are proto-capitalists who are acting in their material self-interest and rationally maximizing profit on this basis. My ethnographic experience suggests alternative possibilities, at least among the most disadvantaged cuentapropistas in Havana, where I did most of my work. Now, I'll try to summarize some of this data. Let me just say, again, in defense of anthropology, that this is not about randomized samples, and you're not going to hear any statistics from me, and there comes the papelito, so I'll have to be very brief anyway. But I share them with the idea that they represent widely held notions about moral action as manifested in and through this kind of market activity. So in one agro, where I spent much of my time, there was a kind of kinship that prevailed among the owners and workers at the various stalls. One produce runner, who is a friend of mine, I'll call him Carlito, he worked for a close friend, and though he was a wage laborer in principle, in practice, their engagement with each other was more like one of business partners. And so, you know, for example, Carlito would appropriate cash from the business seemingly at random, and he would use it throughout the day to buy lunch, coffee, and cigarettes from roving vendors in the plaza. And then the boss, in turn, would expect him to keep the business running if he just didn't show up to work or if he left town for a few days in long stretches of time. And there were all kinds of reciprocal relations like this that I wish I had more time to get into that characterize the kinds of things that Cubans refer to as invento. And what makes them special from an anthropological perspective is that they seem to represent a kind of gift exchange in the modality of a market. Right? And what's interesting about gift exchange as opposed to commodity exchange is that it has a diffuse nature that allows people to maintain relationships over a long stretch of time. Right? And they're not just about maximizing profit, it's also about, if you want to use the term maximizing social obligation and social relationships. So money matters in these contexts, but it matters more as a means of expressing these gift relationships. Right? It becomes an instrumental form of gift, in effect. I'm going to skip over a lot and just jump to the end, since I'm running out of time. And let me just say that I think that this kind of activity does have subaltern political consequences, even though, as I said, people don't think of what they're doing as political. Why is that? Well, for one thing, a lot of times, as I insinuated before, you're doing this against state regulations. And that might involve paying off an inspector if you're, say, running a casa particular. And we tend to look at it and say, aha, corruption. Now, one of my friends, the owner of a casa particular, who supported almost all of her neighbors through this effort because she made a lot of money, right, and felt obligated to do so because they helped her, would say about this, I see these payments as normal, as part of the system. Estas son las vías que hacemos buscando para, estas son las vías que hemos buscado para resolvernos la vida. Y así es, nos estamos ayudando uno a otro. And I actually believe her when she says that. I mean, we were pretty close. So Invento, by definition, again, is not an individualist project. It makes the achievement of a minimum standard of living subservient to social obligations, and it demands a measured consideration for the survival of others whom one helps and on whom one depends. Ironically, and this goes somewhat to what Daniel was just telling us about, where capitalism seems most likely to emerge full bloom in Cuba is in the bosom of the one-party state, and to the greatest benefit of the political elite, as we've seen in post-Soviet Russia. I do agree with that part of what we've been hearing. And actually, I think a lot of ordinary Cubans are also afraid of this prospect. So one of the handymen I knew, who was a cuentapropista, used to tell me that he was worried about what he called savage capitalism. And this is a term that it's not just his, you hear it a lot in Cuba. Emerging in a post-Castro future at the hands of elites who were committed to the authoritarian state, but not to its moral project. I've tried to show that most ordinary Cubans working in the praxis of Invento are actually committed to a kind of socialist morality, and I call it competitive solidarity. In these practices, they constantly draw the state into their everyday lives and remake socialism in the process, if only in localized, intimate ways. It is no wonder then that they also call this la luchita. Invento is already as political as it is economic.